In the vast expanse of history, few individuals have risen so meteorically, shaken the entirety of Europe with such immense force, only to fall in such dramatic fashion. He was an outsider from the island of Corsica, yet became the Emperor of the French, a military genius who reshaped the map of Europe through firepower and force, a visionary ruler bent on reform, whose legal code continues to influence the world to this day, and yet, also a relentless conqueror who inflicted the trauma of war upon countless families. His life was a tapestry of contradictions and legends, woven with threads of power, ambition, glory, and destruction. He is Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, let us journey through the mists of time to meet this giant who shaped the course of world history, exploring his extraordinary life from a Corsican boy to the master of Europe, and finally, a prisoner on the island of St. Helena. Chapter 1. The Eagle from Corsica, the Opportunity of Revolution. On August 15, 1769, on the rugged, mountainous Mediterranean island of Corsica, in the town of Ajaccio, a soul destined to shake the world was born. He was named Napoleon Bonaparte, a name he would later Frenchify to the one we know so well, Napoleon Bonaparte. At this time, Corsica had been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France less than a year prior, and the island's inhabitants generally harbored hostility and distrust towards French rule. Napoleon's family belonged to the local minor nobility. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and an opportunist who chose to cooperate with the French occupiers to secure advantages for his family. This decision enabled Napoleon to qualify for an education in mainland France. Napoleon's childhood was not particularly happy. He was the second child in the family, known for his stubborn, solitary, and even somewhat volatile temperament. Due to the family's modest means and his strong Corsican accent, he was often mocked and ostracized by his aristocratic classmates in French schools. This experience as an outsider and the discrimination he faced perhaps instilled in him a deep sense of insecurity, but it also forged his resilience and a burning desire to prove himself. He poured his energy into his studies, showing exceptional talent, particularly in mathematics and history. He was an avid reader, especially fond of Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans. The great deeds of ancient heroes undoubtedly ignited a yearning for glory and power in his young heart. In 1779, at the age of just 10, Napoleon entered the military school at Brienne-le-Château in France. 5 years later, thanks to his outstanding academic performance, he was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris to specialize in artillery. Artillery was then a relatively technical branch requiring knowledge and skill, unlike the cavalry and infantry, which were dominated by the old aristocracy. This provided a path for advancement for someone like Napoleon, talented, but not from the highest nobility. At the École Militaire, he maintained his diligent study habits, immersing himself in military theory, philosophy, law, and other subjects. The works of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau also profoundly shaped his views on politics and society. In 1785, his father Carlo died, plunging the family into financial difficulty. This spurred him to work even harder, completing the 3-year curriculum in just 1 year. He graduated with the rank of second lieutenant and was assigned to the La Fère artillery regiment. He was only 16 years old. During his first few years in the army, Napoleon's life was relatively uneventful, spent moving between various garrisons. He used his free time to continue reading and writing, even penning a novel about Corsican history, revealing his lingering desire for his homeland's independence and dissatisfaction with French rule. However, the immense wave that would change his destiny was about to arrive. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted. This revolution, rallying under the cry of liberty, equality, fraternity, destroyed the Bourbon monarchy that had ruled France for centuries and dismantled the old hierarchical system. It also opened unprecedented doors of opportunity for talented young men like Napoleon, whose origins were not of the highest nobility. In the early stages of the revolution, Napoleon's thoughts were conflicted. He was inspired by Enlightenment ideals and agreed with some revolutionary principles, yet he felt uneasy about the chaos and violence it unleashed. He briefly returned to Corsica, attempting to play a role in the local political struggles, even clashing with Pasquale Paoli, the hero who had once championed Corsican independence. Ultimately, due to his family's break with Paoli, the Bonapartes were forced to flee Corsica in 1793, definitively aligning themselves with the French revolutionary cause. For Napoleon, this event signified a complete break with Corsica. He now fully committed his future destiny to France. Upon returning to mainland France, Napoleon rejoined the Revolutionary Army. The French Republic was then beset by internal and external crises, constant royalist uprisings within, and military intervention from the First Coalition, formed by Britain, Austria, Prussia, and others from without. It was amidst this turmoil that Napoleon's military talents began to shine. In late 1793, the vital southern port of Toulon was occupied by royalists and British and Spanish forces, posing a grave threat to the Republic. Napoleon, then only a 24-year-old artillery captain, keenly assessed the situation. He proposed a crucial strategy to his commanders: concentrate artillery fire on the Fort de l'Aiguillette on the western side of the harbor, thereby controlling the inner roadstead. His plan was initially not fully adopted, but as the siege dragged on, the newly appointed commander, General de Gaumier, recognized its brilliance. He adopted Napoleon's plan and put him in charge of its execution. Napoleon led from the front, organizing artillery positions and directing fire with precision, ultimately succeeding in capturing the key heights. The Allied fleet was forced to withdraw, and Toulon was recaptured. This victory was immensely significant, not only stabilizing the situation in southern France, but also catapulting Napoleon to fame. For his exceptional performance at the Siege of Toulon, he was promoted to brigadier general at the astonishing age of 24, becoming one of the youngest generals in the Republic's army. The Siege of Toulon was the first major milestone in Napoleon's military career. It demonstrated not only his outstanding tactical insight and command ability, but, more importantly, brought him to the attention of high-ranking political figures in France. He established connections with Augustin Robespierre, an important figure in the Jacobin faction and the younger brother of Maximilien Robespierre. However, his good fortune was short-lived. The Thermidorian reaction in July 1794 overthrew the Jacobin rule. The Robespierre brothers were sent to the guillotine, and Napoleon, due to his association with them, was implicated and briefly imprisoned. Although quickly released, he was removed from his military post and found himself at a low point in his life. During these frustrating days in Paris, Napoleon lived in poverty, his future uncertain. But he did not give up, actively seeking new opportunities. In October 1795, a royalist armed rebellion erupted in Paris, attempting to overthrow the weak Directory government established by the Thermidorians. In this critical moment, Paul Barras, one of the directors, remembered the young artillery general who had distinguished himself at Toulon. Napoleon was given command at the crucial hour to suppress the revolt. He acted decisively, securing cannons found by Joachim Murat, later a marshal and king of Naples, and deploying them strategically in the streets of central Paris. When the rebels launched their attack, Napoleon unhesitatingly ordered his men to open fire, ruthlessly dispersing the crowd with salvos of grapeshot, which he contemptuously referred to as a whiff of grapeshot. This event, known as the 13 Vendémiaire Uprising, though brutal, swiftly stabilized the situation in Paris and saved the Directory. Napoleon became the savior of Paris, was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior, regained military power, and firmly established himself in the French political arena. Shortly thereafter, through Barras's connections, Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior with 2 children. Josephine was a prominent figure in Parisian society with extensive connections. Despite her somewhat tarnished reputation and fading youth, Napoleon was captivated by her charm and sophistication, while also recognizing the political benefits she could bring. On March 9, 1796, Napoleon and Josephine were married in a simple civil ceremony. Just 2 days later, he bid farewell to his new wife and departed for Italy to assume command of the Army of Italy. This appointment was both a reward from the Directory for his actions during 13 Vendemiaire and perhaps an attempt to move this increasingly powerful military figure away from the center of power. None of them anticipated that this assignment would mark the beginning of Napoleon's path of conquest, forever changing the map of Europe. Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance, was about to witness the rise of a new military star and his art of war that would make the entire continent tremble. Chapter 2. Conqueror of Italy, explorer of Egypt, the coup of 18 Brumaire. When the 26-year-old Napoleon arrived in Nice to take command of the army of Italy, he found an army plagued by low morale, poor equipment, lack of supplies, and even unpaid wages. The soldiers were ragged, and discipline was lax. Yet, Napoleon addressed his troops with stirring words. "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. You will find their honor, glory, and riches." He promised not just victory, but tangible rewards, greatly boosting their fighting spirit. His adversaries were the powerful Austrian Empire and its ally, the Kingdom of Sardinia, Piedmont. The anti-French coalition had deployed substantial forces in Italy, commanded by experienced veterans. But Napoleon brought a new philosophy of war. He emphasized speed, concentration of force, and taking the offensive. Employing flexible and mobile tactics, he aimed to separate the Austrian and Sardinian armies and defeat them individually. The campaign began in April 1796. Napoleon swiftly led the French army through the Alpine passes, first defeating the Austrians in successive engagements at Montenat, Millesimo, and Dago, forcing them away from their Sardinian allies. He then turned fiercely on the Sardinians, achieving victories at Siva and Mondovi. This forced King Victor Amadeus III of Sardinia to sign the Armistice of Cherasco at the end of April, withdrawing from the war and ceding Savoy and Nice to France. In less than 2 weeks, Napoleon had neutralized a formidable opponent, opening the way for an offensive into Austrian-controlled Lombardy. Next, Napoleon set his sights on the Austrian army. On May 10th, at Lodi, in a bid to seize a crucial bridge over the Adda River, Napoleon personally braved intense Austrian cannon fire, grabbing a standard and leading his grenadiers in the charge. While the strategic significance of this battle was later debated, the victory at the Bridge of Lodi enormously enhanced Napoleon's prestige and charisma among his soldiers. He reportedly began to believe he was a man of destiny, destined for great achievements. The French army pursued its advantage, entering Milan, where they were welcomed by Italians hoping to throw off Austrian rule. In Milan, Napoleon established the Transpadane Republic, later merged into the Cisalpine Republic, initiating political reorganization in Italy. Concurrently, he ruthlessly levied huge contributions from the occupied territories and shipped vast quantities of art treasures back to Paris. While this enriched the French treasury and the Louvre, it also sowed seeds of resentment among the Italians. The Austrian Empire, unwilling to accept defeat, repeatedly sent reinforcements into Italy to relieve their forces besieged in the fortress of Mantua. From the summer of 1796 to early 1797, veteran commanders like Dagobert von Wurmser and Joseph Alvinci led major Austrian armies south, clashing fiercely with Napoleon. In key battles such as Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli, Napoleon, through his brilliant command artistry, repeatedly defeated Austrian forces, often significantly outnumbering his own. The Battle of Arcole was particularly legendary. Fought over 3 days, November 15th to 17th, 1s96, the French repeatedly tried and failed to capture the bridge at Arcole against tenacious Austrian resistance. Legend has it that Napoleon, emulating his actions at Lodi, again seized a flag and charged, though unsuccessfully. He even fell into a marsh and was nearly captured. His bravery greatly inspired his troops. Ultimately, the French secured victory through flanking maneuvers. The Battle of Rivoli in January 1797 was a masterpiece of Napoleon's generalship. Accurately anticipating the Austrian line of attack, he concentrated his forces and decisively crushed Alvinci's main army within a single day. With the surrender of Mantua on February 2nd, Austrian dominance in Italy completely crumbled. Napoleon did not stop there. He marched north, crossing the Alps and advancing directly towards the Austrian capital, Vienna. Austria was compelled to sue for peace. On October 17, 1797, France and Austria signed the Treaty of Campo Formio. Austria recognized French control over the left bank of the Rhine, acknowledged the French-established Cisalpine Republic and other satellite states in Italy, and ceded Belgium to France. In compensation, Austria received most of the territory of the Republic of Venice, effectively ending its thousand-year history. The victory in the First Italian Campaign propelled Napoleon's fame to its zenith. He proved himself not only an outstanding military commander, but also demonstrated diplomatic and political administrative skills. He established sister republics in Italy, implementing French-style reforms and spreading revolutionary ideas, albeit alongside plunder and domination. He bypassed the Directory in Paris, directly negotiating and concluding the treaty with Austria, acting almost as an independent political power. The Directory government in Paris was both reliant on and wary of him. Upon his triumphant return to Paris, he was hailed as a hero. However, France's primary European rival, Great Britain, remained defiant. The powerful British Royal Navy controlled the seas, making a direct invasion of the British Isles exceedingly difficult. To strike at Britain, Napoleon proposed a daring plan: an expedition to Egypt. His objectives were to occupy Egypt, sever Britain's connection with India, threaten British colonial interests in the East, and simultaneously remove himself and his highly successful Italian army temporarily from the French political center, thus alleviating the Directory's suspicions. The plan also had scientific and cultural dimensions. Napoleon organized a large contingent of scholars to accompany the army to study Egypt's ancient civilization, geography, and nature. In May 1798, Napoleon led a vast fleet carrying over 30,000 soldiers and nearly 200 scholars out of Toulon. Evading the British Mediterranean fleet led by Horatio Nelson, they successfully landed in Egypt. After first seizing the island of Malta, the French landed near Alexandria. Egypt, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, was effectively ruled by Mamluk warlords. On July 21st, at the famous Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon faced the Mamluk cavalry charge. Employing solid square formations, his troops inflicted a devastating defeat on the Mamluks with minimal French casualties, subsequently occupying Cairo. Before the battle, he delivered his famous line to his soldiers: "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you from the top of these pyramids." However, military success on land was soon overshadowed by a naval catastrophe. On August 1st, Nelson finally caught the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. In the Battle of the Nile, also known as the Battle of Aboukir Bay, the British Navy annihilated the French fleet. The French expeditionary force was trapped in Egypt, its communication lines with France severed. Despite the difficult circumstances, Napoleon established French rule in Egypt, implemented some reforms, and encouraged the accompanying scholars in their research. It was during this expedition that French soldiers discovered the famous Rosetta Stone, providing the key for Jean-François Champollion to later decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. However, French control in Egypt was precarious. Plagues were rampant, supplies were scarce, and local resistance frequently erupted. In early 1799, to preempt a potential Ottoman attack from Syria, Napoleon led his army north into Syria. The French captured Gaza and Jaffa, but were unable to take the fortress of Acre after a prolonged siege. Ultimately, plagued by disease and supply issues, they were forced to retreat back to Egypt. During the siege of Jaffa, Napoleon ordered the execution of several thousand surrendered Ottoman prisoners, a dark stain on his military career. While stranded in Egypt, Napoleon closely followed the situation in France. He learned that after his departure, the Second Coalition had formed against France, that French armies were suffering defeats in Italy and Germany, that the Directory government was corrupt and incompetent, that political instability reigned, and that popular discontent was high. Napoleon realized the time was ripe for his return. In August 1799, he secretly handed over command of the army in Egypt to General Kleber. Taking only a few trusted followers, he boarded a small ship and, once again, miraculously evaded the British fleet's blockade, landing back in France on October 9th. Napoleon's return was met with fervent enthusiasm by the French people, who saw him as the hero capable of saving the nation from crisis. Meanwhile, political circles in Paris were plotting a coup. Emmanuel Joseph Size, one of the directors and a political theorist, desired a stronger, more stable government to replace the feeble Directory. He needed a military strongman, a sword, to help him realize his plan. The newly returned and celebrated Napoleon was the ideal candidate. The two men quickly reached an understanding and began plotting. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, year 8 in the French Republican calendar, the coup began. Napoleon's allies spread rumors of a Jacobin plot in Paris, persuading the Council of Ancients, Upper House, and the Council of 500, Lower House, to relocate their sessions to the Palace of St. Cloud outside Paris. Napoleon was appointed commander of the Paris garrison, tasked with protecting the legislative bodies. The next day, 19 Brumaire, Napoleon went to St. Cloud with his troops. His speech to the Council of Ancients went relatively smoothly, but in the Council of 500, he faced fierce opposition and hostile questions. Some deputies shouted, "Down with the dictator," and "Outlaw him." The situation spiraled out of control. Napoleon was jostled and appeared momentarily flustered. At this critical juncture, his younger brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, then president of the Council of 500, played a decisive role. Napoleon drew his sword, proclaimed to the soldiers that certain deputies were attempting to assassinate General Bonaparte, and ordered the troops to enter the chamber and disperse the assembly. The soldiers stormed in, and the deputies fled in disarray. That evening, with the support of a small number of remaining deputies, decrees were passed abolishing the Directory and establishing a provisional consulate. The new executive body consisted of 3 consuls, Napoleon Bonaparte, Size, and Roger Ducasse. However, Napoleon swiftly leveraged his military power and political acumen to consolidate all power in his own hands. He spearheaded the drafting of the new constitution of the year 8, which established the positions of first consul, second consul, and third consul, each serving a 10-year term. The first consul held almost all executive power and the right to initiate legislation, while the other 2 consuls served merely in an advisory capacity. Unsurprisingly, Napoleon became the first consul. The coup of 18 Brumaire marked the end of the turbulent French Revolution and the beginning of Napoleon's era of rule. Backed by military might, he seized power through a clever, though not perfectly executed, coup, becoming the supreme ruler of the French Republic. From a Corsican boy to the conqueror of Italy, then the explorer of Egypt, Napoleon's life trajectory was filled with adventure and opportunity. Now, holding the reins of power in France, he would begin to reshape the nation according to his will, and subsequently, change the face of Europe. His gaze was already fixed on a higher prize, the crown symbolizing supreme power. Chapter 3: Reformer of the Consulate, Emperor of the French, the son of Austerlitz. Upon becoming first consul, Napoleon's immediate priorities were to stabilize the domestic situation, restore order, and consolidate his own power. France had endured a decade of revolutionary turmoil, leaving its economy devastated, society fractured, finances chaotic, the royalist rebellion in the Vendée region still simmering, and facing the ongoing threat of the powerful Second Coalition abroad. Napoleon demonstrated exceptional administrative talent and political skill, embarking on sweeping reforms. Politically, he suppressed both radical Jacobin remnants and royalist elements to maintain social stability. Simultaneously, he pursued a policy of reconciliation, allowing many nobles, émigrés, who had fled during the revolution to return to France, provided they swore allegiance to the new regime. He championed the principle of careers open to talent, recruiting capable individuals into government regardless of their background or past political affiliations. This included the shrewd Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord as Minister of Foreign Affairs and the efficient Joseph Fouché as Minister of Police. He established a highly centralized and efficient administrative system, notably creating the prefect system, where centrally appointed prefects administered the departments, provinces, strengthening central control over the regions. Economically, to address the financial crisis, Napoleon founded the Bank of France, Banque de France, in 1800. It was responsible for issuing currency, stabilizing the financial system, and providing credit to the state and businesses. He reformed the tax system, making it fairer and more efficient, providing the government with a stable source of revenue. He encouraged industrial and commercial development, investing in infrastructure like roads and canals to stimulate economic recovery. Religiously, the revolution had seen church property confiscated and clergy persecuted, leading to a rupture between France and the papacy and deep divisions within society. Napoleon understood the importance of religion in maintaining social order. He initiated negotiations with Pope Pius VII, resulting in the Concordat of 1801. This agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of Frenchmen, not the state religion, stipulated that the state would pay clergy salaries, and established that bishops would be nominated by the first consul and appointed by the Pope. This resolved the long-standing religious conflict, won the support of Catholics, and also increased state control over the church. Legally, one of Napoleon's most significant contributions was the codification of the French civil law, culminating in the promulgation of the Civil Code, later known worldwide as the Napoleonic Code, Code Napoleon, in 1804. This code consolidated Roman law, customary law, and the achievements of the French Revolution, affirming crucial principles such as equality before the law, the abolition of feudal privileges, the protection of private property, and freedom of contract. Its clear structure and concise language made it a model for modern bourgeois legal codes. It remains largely in force in France today and was adopted or adapted by numerous countries and regions worldwide, profoundly impacting global legal history. Although the code also reflected patriarchal attitudes in areas like family law, its overall progressive significance is undeniable. In education, Napoleon established a national education system from primary schools to universities. He particularly focused on founding public secondary schools, lycées, designed to produce competent officers, civil servants, and professionals for the state. The education system emphasized discipline, patriotism, and loyalty to the nation. To recognize meritorious service to the state, regardless of birth, Napoleon created the Legion of Honor, Légion d'honneur, in 1802. It remains France's highest decoration to this day. While implementing domestic reforms, Napoleon also had to confront external military threats. In 1800, he once again displayed his military genius. He personally led the Army of the Reserve on an unexpected crossing of the Alps via the Great St. Bernard Pass, a feat comparable in difficulty to Hannibal's crossing, entering Italy to strike the rear of the Austrian army besieging Genoa. On June 14th, at the Battle of Marengo, the French army faced near defeat, but, reinforced by the timely arrival of General Desaix's troops, Desaix tragically died in the battle, launched a counterattack, and secured a decisive victory. In December of the same year, another French army under General Moreau decisively defeated the Austrians at Hohenlinden in Germany. These successive military setbacks forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Lunéville in 1801, reaffirming the terms of the Treaty of Campo Formio and recognizing French control over its satellite republics in Italy, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. With Austria's withdrawal, the Second Coalition collapsed. Great Britain, the remaining adversary, was also weary from the long war and facing domestic anti-war sentiment, becoming amenable to peace. In March 1802, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens. This marked the first period of general peace in Europe since 1792. The arrival of peace, combined with the visible success of domestic reforms, elevated Napoleon's prestige to new heights. In 1802, through a plebiscite with a highly managed outcome, Napoleon was made first consul for life, further consolidating his autocratic power. However, he was not satisfied. The thirst for power, the desire to establish a stable hereditary dynasty, and the need to deal with domestic and foreign opposition, such as the Cadoudal plot, a royalist assassination attempt uncovered in early 1804, which Napoleon used as a pretext to execute the Duke of Enghien, a Bourbon prince suspected of involvement, shocking European royalty. All pushed him towards the ultimate pinnacle of power. In May 1804, the Senate proposed granting Napoleon Bonaparte the hereditary title of Emperor of the French. This proposal was again overwhelmingly approved by a plebiscite. Napoleon's elevation to emperor marked the end of the First French Republic and the beginning of the First French Empire. This seemed a betrayal of the French Revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, but for many French people, weary of instability and yearning for order and glory, a strong emperor seemed the guarantor of national stability and strength. On December 2nd, 1804, a magnificent coronation ceremony was held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Pope Pius VII traveled to Paris, prepared to crown Napoleon. However, during the ceremony, in a famous gesture, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head before crowning Empress Josephine, who knelt before him. This act symbolized that his power came not from divine right, but from his own achievements and the nominal mandate of the people. He intended to demonstrate that imperial authority superseded papal authority. After becoming emperor, Napoleon began establishing a new imperial nobility, bestowing titles like prince, duke, and count upon his relatives and meritorious followers. However, this was a new aristocracy based on service and loyalty, not the old one based on bloodline. His brothers and sisters were installed on thrones across Europe, attempting to create a European system dominated by the Bonaparte dynasty. However, the peace brought by the Treaty of Amiens was short-lived. Fundamental conflicts between France and Britain over colonies, trade, maritime supremacy, and influence on the European continent remained unresolved. Napoleon's expansionist actions in Europe, such as annexing Piedmont, reorganizing the Swiss Confederation, and exerting influence in the German states, alarmed Britain and other major European powers. Britain refused to evacuate Malta as stipulated by the treaty, and relations rapidly deteriorated. In May 1803, Britain declared war on France, shattering the peace. Napoleon immediately assembled a massive army, known as the Grande Armée, at Boulogne and other coastal locations, preparing to cross the English Channel and invade Britain directly. But the formidable strength of the British Royal Navy presented an insurmountable obstacle. To gain naval superiority, even temporarily, Napoleon devised complex plans to lure the main British fleet away from the Channel. While Napoleon prepared for the invasion of Britain, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger successfully exploited European fears of Napoleon's expansionism, along with Tsar Alexander I of Russia's indignation over the execution of the Duke of Enghien and his ambitions in the Mediterranean, to form the Third Coalition in 1805. Its members included Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden. Facing this continental threat, Napoleon reacted swiftly, demonstrating his astounding strategic insight and decisiveness. He abandoned the plan to invade Britain and marched the Grande Armée with incredible speed from the Channel coast eastward to confront the Austrian and Russian armies. His goal was to defeat the Austrian army before the main Russian force could arrive. The speed and coordination of the French army far exceeded their opponents' expectations. In October, Napoleon executed a perfect encirclement maneuver at Ulm, forcing the Austrian General Max von Liebrich and tens of thousands of his troops to surrender without a major battle. The victory at Ulm opened the road to Vienna, and Napoleon occupied the Austrian capital in November. However, on the very day after the triumph at Ulm, October 21st, off Cape Trafalgar on the southwest coast of Spain, Nelson's British fleet decisively defeated the combined Franco-Spanish fleet. Although Nelson himself was killed in the Battle of Trafalgar utterly destroyed French naval power, shattered any possibility of Napoleon invading Britain, and secured British maritime supremacy for the next century. Henceforth, Napoleon could only focus his conquests entirely on the European continent. After losing Vienna, Austrian Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I concentrated the main Russo-Austrian allied army in the region of Moravia, hoping for a decisive battle against Napoleon. Napoleon, II, desired a conclusive victory to end the war. He carefully chose the battlefield, near the Pratzen Heights, southeast of Brno, at Austerlitz. On December 2nd, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, the Battle of Austerlitz commenced. This battle is hailed as the most brilliant victory of Napoleon's military career and a masterpiece of tactical art. Before the battle, Napoleon deliberately feigned weakness, particularly on his right flank, enticing the Allies to believe the French were outnumbered and vulnerable there. The Allies fell into the trap, committing their main forces to an attack on the French right, intending to cut off Napoleon's line of retreat. This weakened their own center, the strategic Pratzen Heights. Under the cover of thick morning fog, Napoleon had already secretly concentrated his main forces in the center. As the sun rose, dispersing the mist, the famous Sun of Austerlitz, Napoleon seized the opportune moment. He ordered Marshal Soult's corps to storm the Pratzen Heights. The French successfully captured this key high ground, splitting the Allied army in two. Subsequently, French forces charged down from the heights, coordinating with attacks from other units, routing the Allies completely. Many fleeing Russian soldiers tried to escape across frozen ponds, only to be bombarded by French artillery, causing the ice to break and thousands to drown. The Battle of Austerlitz was a perfect battle of annihilation. The French achieved victory with relatively light casualties, around 9,000, while inflicting nearly 30,000 losses, killed, wounded, captured on the Allies. The Tsar and the Austrian Emperor fled the battlefield in disarray. This Battle of the Three Emperors, Napoleon, Francis II, Alexander I, decisively crushed the Third Coalition. Austria was forced to sign the harsh Treaty of Pressburg, ceding large territories, including Venice and Tyrol, and paying substantial reparations. Under Napoleon's pressure, the Holy Roman Empire was formally dissolved in 1806. Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in the German states, placing many of them under French protection and further expanding French influence. The victory at Austerlitz marked the apex of Napoleon's and the First French Empire's power. He became the undisputed master of continental Europe. His soldiers adored him, and the French people swelled with pride at the glory he brought them. However, the pinnacle of power often harbors hidden dangers. Continuous warfare and expansion inevitably provoked vigilance and resistance from other major powers. The next challenger was already quietly stepping onto the stage of history. Chapter 4. Master of Europe, the continental blockade strain, the peninsular quagmire, and Russia's snows. The brilliant victory at Austerlitz did not bring lasting peace. The Kingdom of Prussia, a military power that had once commanded respect under Frederick the Great, grew increasingly alarmed and humiliated by France's rapidly expanding influence in the German states, particularly the establishment of the Confederation of the Rhine, which directly threatened its position in Central Europe. Encouraged by the war party, including Queen Louise, and overly confident in their own army's strength, still basking in the glory of Frederick's era, King Frederick William III of Prussia decided to challenge Napoleon. In the autumn of 1806, Prussia issued an ultimatum demanding French withdrawal from German territories, leading to the formation of the Fourth Coalition, primarily Prussia, Russia, Britain, and Sweden. Napoleon treated Prussia's challenge with contempt and reacted swiftly. On October 14, 1806, the French and Prussian armies clashed simultaneously at Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon personally commanded the main French force, routing a portion of the Prussian army under Prince Hohenlohe. Meanwhile, at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout's Third Corps, outnumbered, encountered the main Prussian army led personally by the King and the Duke of Brunswick, who was mortally wounded in the battle. Davout displayed incredible composure and resilience, leading his troops in a tenacious defense that miraculously resulted in the complete defeat of the Prussian main force. The twin battles of Jena-Auerstedt were catastrophic for Prussia. Its once mighty army was effectively destroyed in a single day. The French pursued relentlessly, rapidly occupying most of Prussia, including the capital, Berlin. Napoleon paid his respects at Frederick the Great's tomb, but then ordered the removal of Frederick's sword and other trophies to Paris. In Berlin, Napoleon issued the famous Berlin Decree, instituting the Continental System, or Continental Blockade. This decree prohibited all ports on the European continent under French control or allied with France from trading with Great Britain. The aim was to cripple the British economy and force Britain to submit. The Continental System became a central policy of Napoleon's later empire, but it created numerous problems. It damaged the economies of continental European nations, led to widespread smuggling, and became a source of future conflicts. Having defeated Prussia, Napoleon continued eastward into Poland to confront the Russian army coming to Prussia's aid. Poles welcomed Napoleon as a liberator, hoping he would help restore the Polish state that had been partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They actively supported the French army. In early 1807, an extremely brutal and bloody winter battle took place at Eylau in East Prussia. The two armies fought fiercely amid snowstorms, suffering horrific casualties on both sides. The battle was inconclusive, a massacre, even by Napoleon's admission. After several months of rest and reinforcement, on June 14, 1807, the anniversary of the Battle of Marengo, the French and Russian armies met again at Friedland. This time, Napoleon achieved a decisive victory, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian army. Tsar Alexander I was forced to sue for peace. In July 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I held a historic meeting on a raft in the middle of the Neman River near Tilsit, East Prussia. They signed the treaties of Tilsit. The terms were extremely harsh for Prussia, which lost nearly half its territory and population, was forced to pay huge reparations, and had its army size restricted. Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw from parts of Prussia's Polish territories, appointing his ally, the King of Saxony, as its duke. More importantly, France and Russia formed an alliance. Alexander I recognized French hegemony on the continent and agreed to join the Continental System, opposing Britain together. The meeting at Tilsit marked another peak of Napoleon's power. At this point, almost all of continental Europe, except for the defiant Britain and a resentful Sweden, was directly or indirectly under Napoleon's control. He stood as the arbiter and master of Europe. However, this seemingly solid imperial system harbored deep-seated crises. The Continental System severely harmed the economies of nations reliant on British trade, causing widespread discontent and resistance. Napoleon's willingness to use force to compel compliance eventually dragged him into two fatal quagmires. The first was the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, a long-standing British ally, refused to enforce the Continental Blockade. In late 1807, Napoleon sent troops through Spain to invade Portugal, occupying Lisbon and forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. The following year, Napoleon exploited internal conflicts within the Spanish royal family, tricking King Charles IV and Crown Prince Ferdinand into abdicating. He then forcibly installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. This blatant interference in Spanish internal affairs ignited fierce resistance from the Spanish people. Starting in 1808, uprisings against French occupation erupted across Spain. The Spanish employed guerrilla warfare, guerrilla meaning little war, a term popularized by this conflict, constantly harassing French supply lines and small detachments, making it impossible for the French to secure control and keeping them perpetually off balance. Britain seized the opportunity, landing an expeditionary force under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, in Portugal to support the Spanish and Portuguese resistance. The Peninsular War, 1807 to 1814, turned into a protracted, brutal, and draining conflict. Although Napoleon himself went to Spain in late 1808 and achieved some victories, he soon departed due to rising tensions in Central Europe, leaving command to his marshals. The French committed hundreds of thousands of troops to the peninsula but could never fully suppress the resistance, becoming deeply bogged down and suffering heavy losses. The war became known as the Spanish Ulcer, continuously draining France's manpower, finances, and prestige, and exposing the fragility of Napoleon's enforced dominion. While the main French forces were mired in Spain, the Austrian Empire saw an opportunity to break free from the constraints of the Treaty of Pressburg and regain lost territories. After implementing military reforms, Austria declared war on France in 1809, forming the Fifth Coalition, mainly Austria and Britain. Napoleon swiftly withdrew some elite units from Spain and raised new conscripts to counter the Austrian threat. Although the French army was less prepared than usual, and Napoleon made some uncharacteristic command errors, the Austrians managed to inflict a tactical defeat on him at the Battle of Ospernessling in May 1809. As the French tried to cross the Danube, they faced fierce resistance, suffered heavy casualties, and were forced to retreat to the island of Lobau. This was the first significant tactical setback Napoleon suffered when personally commanding a battle. However, Napoleon quickly regrouped. In early July, at the Battle of Wagram, after 2 days of intense fighting, the French finally defeated the Austrians, albeit at a tremendous cost. Following Wagram, Austria was once again forced to sue for peace, signing the even harsher Treaty of Schönbrunn. Austria ceded more territory and agreed to join the continental system. To further solidify relations with Austria and address the issue of succession, as Empress Josephine had failed to produce an heir, Napoleon made a calculated, cold decision. He divorced his beloved Josephine. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, the daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria. This political marriage, though tinged with humiliation for Austria, did provide Napoleon with a legitimate heir. In 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, who was proclaimed the King of Rome. At this moment, the Napoleonic Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, linked by marriage to the ancient Habsburg dynasty, seemingly at the zenith of its power. But the foundations of the empire were already beginning to crack. The continental system failed to strangle Britain, instead causing economic hardship and resentment across Europe. The guerrilla war in Spain continued its relentless strain. More critically, the Franco-Russian alliance forged at Tilsit began to fracture. Tsar Alexander I grew increasingly dissatisfied with the economic damage caused by the continental system to Russia. Russia and France also had conflicting interests regarding Poland. The existence of the Duchy of Warsaw threatened Russian interests, the Balkans, and the Near East. Napoleon's marriage to an Austrian princess also disappointed and alarmed Alexander, who had hoped for a marriage alliance to improve Russo-French relations. Alexander gradually relaxed enforcement of the blockade against British trade, which Napoleon viewed as a betrayal. By 1811, Napoleon concluded that war with Russia was inevitable. He began assembling an unprecedentedly massive army to invade Russia and compel the Tsar to adhere to the alliance obligations. This new Grande Army numbered over 600,000 men, drawn from France, its vassal states, and allies, including contingents from Austria and Prussia, a veritable army of 20 nations. It was an expedition that gambled the fate of the empire. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon led the Grande Armée across the Neman River into Russian territory. He expected to crush the main Russian army in a swift, decisive battle near the border, similar to Austerlitz or Friedland, forcing the Tsar to sue for peace. However, the Russians adopted a different strategy. Under the command of Michael Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, the Russian army avoided large-scale engagements, instead employing a strategy of strategic retreat and scorched earth. They drew the French deeper into Russia while destroying villages, crops, and supplies along the way, denying the invaders sustenance. The vast Russian landscape, poor roads, scorching summer heat, and immense logistical challenges began to take their toll on the enormous French army. Soldiers succumbed to disease, starvation, and constant harassment by small Russian detachments. Although the French won tactical victories at places like Smolensk, they failed to trap the main Russian army. On September 7th, near the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, Kutuzov decided to make a stand. The Battle of Borodino was the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Nearly 300,000 troops clashed fiercely for over 12 hours, resulting in horrific casualties on both sides, potentially exceeding 70,000 combined. The French eventually captured the Russian positions, achieving a tactical victory, but failed to destroy the Russian army, which retreated in good order. Napoleon himself called it the most terrible of all my battles. After Borodino, Kutuzov made the difficult but wise decision to abandon Moscow to preserve his army. On September 14th, Napoleon entered a deserted Moscow. He hoped the capture of the ancient capital would compel the Tsar to surrender. However, shortly after the French entered, fires broke out across the city. The cause remains debated, possibly deliberate Russian arson or accidents. The Great Fire of Moscow raged for days, reducing most of the city to ashes and destroying supplies and shelter the French might have used. Napoleon waited in the burnout shell of Moscow for 5 weeks, sending several peace overtures to Alexander I, all of which went unanswered. The Tsar was determined to fight on. With winter approaching, supplies dwindling, and morale plummeting, Napoleon finally realized he had to retreat. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon ordered the French army to leave Moscow. He initially planned to retreat southward through unspoiled territory, but Kutuzov's army blocked this route at the Battle of Maloyaroslavets. After fierce fighting, the French were forced to retreat along the same devastated Smolensk road they had advanced upon. The ensuing Great Retreat became one of the most horrific military disasters in history. The brutal Russian winter arrived early, with temperatures plunging to -20 or -30 degrees Celsius, -4 to -22 Fahrenheit. Ill-clad and starving French soldiers struggled through snow and ice, facing not only extreme cold, hunger, and disease, but also constant pursuit and attacks by the Russian regular army, Cossack cavalry, and partisans. Soldiers and horses died in droves from freezing, starvation, or combat. In late November, at the Berezina River, the remnants of the Grande Armée were nearly surrounded by 3 Russian armies. Their situation was desperate. Thanks to the heroic efforts of pontoon engineers who built 2 makeshift bridges under fire in freezing conditions, and the valiant rearguard action fought by Marshal Ney and others, the bulk of the remaining fighting force managed to cross the river and escape the trap. However, losses were still catastrophic, with vast numbers of stragglers and equipment abandoned. The crossing of the Berezina became synonymous with disaster and defeat. In early December, Napoleon left the remnants of the army under Murat's command and rushed back to Paris in a sleigh to stabilize the domestic situation and begin raising a new army. When the shattered remains of the Grande Armée finally staggered out of Russia, only a few tens of thousands were left from the original force of over 600,000, with even fewer fit for combat. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was the turning point in Napoleon's fortunes. It not only cost France an entire generation of its finest soldiers, but, more importantly, shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility, severely weakening the French Empire's power and prestige. News of the disaster spread across Europe, inspiring long-subjugated nations and peoples with the hope of liberation. The call for freedom was about to resound across the German plains. Napoleon's empire was entering its twilight. Chapter 5. The defeat at Leipzig, exile to Elba, Waterloo's end, and St. Helena's solitude. The catastrophic defeat in Russia galvanized anti-French sentiment across Europe. Prussia was the first to act. General York von Wartenberg, commanding the Prussian contingent force to ally with France, unilaterally signed the Convention of Torringen with the Russians, declaring neutrality and effectively defecting from the French army. In early 1813, Prussia formally allied with Russia, declared war on France, and called upon all German people to rise up against Napoleon's rule. The War of Liberation, Befreiungskrieg, had begun. Facing this crisis, Napoleon once again demonstrated his astonishing organizational skills and willpower. Returning swiftly to Paris, he utilized the empire's powerful conscription system to raise a new army of hundreds of thousands within a short time. However, this army consisted mainly of inexperienced young conscripts and hastily assembled National Guardsmen. Its combat effectiveness was far inferior to the veteran troops lost in Russia, especially lacking experienced cavalry and artillery. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1813, Napoleon personally led this new army into Germany and initially achieved a series of tactical victories. In May, he defeated the Russo-Prussian forces twice, at Lutzen and Botzen. However, these victories came at a high cost and failed to achieve decisive results. The Allied main forces remained intact. During the fighting, Napoleon's close friend and Grand Marshal of the Palace, Géraud Duroc, was killed, a significant personal blow. Following these battles, both sides agreed to a temporary armistice of Pleiswitz. During this truce, both sides scrambled for diplomatic support and reinforcements. The Austrian Empire, guided by its foreign minister Clemens von Metternich, played the role of mediator but leaned towards joining the anti-French coalition. Metternich presented Napoleon with peace terms demanding France relinquish vast territories and restore the balance of power in Europe. Napoleon rejected these terms, viewing them as humiliating, still confident he could secure victory through military means. With the breakdown of negotiations, Austria formally declared war on France in August 1813. Sweden, led by Napoleon's former marshal, now Crown Prince of Sweden, Jean Bernadotte, also joined the coalition. The Sixth Coalition was now fully formed, encompassing Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and virtually all other major European powers. France found itself unprecedentedly isolated. When hostilities resumed, the Allies adopted the coordinated Trachenberg Plan, designed to avoid direct confrontation with Napoleon's main army, instead concentrating superior forces against the armies commanded by his marshals. This strategy proved effective. French forces suffered defeats at Grossbeeren, Kulm, Katzbach, and Dennowitz. Although Napoleon won a major victory against an Allied main army at Dresden, he could not reverse the overall strategic tide turning against him. The final showdown took place near Leipzig in Saxony. From October 16 to 19, 1813, the two sides committed over 500,000 troops to a colossal engagement known as the Battle of Leipzig or the Battle of Nations. In this four-day struggle, the French fought fiercely but were overwhelmingly outnumbered, around 190,000 French against over 300,000 allies, and faced severe logistical difficulties. The defection of Saxon and Württemberg troops during the battle further worsened their situation. Ultimately, the French army was forced to retreat. In the chaos of the withdrawal, the single bridge over the Elster River was prematurely blown up by panicked engineers, trapping tens of thousands of French rearguard troops who were either captured or drowned. Among the dead was Prince Józef Poniatowski, a Polish prince and Marshal of France. The Battle of Leipzig was the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars and a decisive defeat for Napoleon. The French suffered enormous casualties, over 70,000 killed, wounded, or captured, and completely lost control of Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved, and Napoleon's dominance in Germany and Italy collapsed. The French army was forced to retreat back across the Rhine into France itself. In early 1814, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops invaded France from the east, north, and south. Napoleon, though severely lacking in manpower and resources, once again displayed his supreme military genius. During this 6 days campaign, battles at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, Beauchamps, commanding a small army, he utilized the advantages of interior lines and rapid maneuver to inflict a series of stunning defeats on the overextended Allied forces under Gebhard von Blücher and Karl Philipp, Prince of Schwarzenberg. This brief period of brilliance seemed like the final flicker of his military career. However, these tactical victories could not alter the overwhelming strategic disadvantage. Allied numbers were too great, and they had learned their lesson, resolving to march directly on Paris rather than be drawn into peripheral battles. Despite Napoleon's attempts to threaten their rear through flanking maneuvers, the Allies pressed on towards the capital. Meanwhile, in the south of France, the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese army crossed the Pyrenees and advanced into French territory. On March 30th, 1814, Allied forces reached the outskirts of Paris. Marshals Auguste de Marmont and Edouard Mortier, tasked with defending the city, resisted for a day but then, to avoid the destruction of Paris, negotiated its surrender. Paris fell on March 31st. Tsar Alexander I and King Frederick William III led the Allied troops into the French capital. Upon hearing of Paris's fall, Napoleon rushed back from the palace of Fontainebleau, but it was too late. His marshals, including Michel Ney, Nicolas Oudinot, and Etienne MacDonald, weary of endless war, refused his orders to continue fighting and urged him to abdicate. The final blow came when Marshal Marmont, whom Napoleon had greatly favored, marched his entire corps over to the Allied side, extinguishing Napoleon's last hope of military resistance. Under immense pressure, on April 6, 1814, Napoleon signed an unconditional abdication at Fontainebleau. In his famous farewell address to his loyal old guard, he bid them an emotional goodbye. According to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, Napoleon renounced the thrones of France and Italy, but was allowed to retain the title of emperor and granted sovereignty over the small Mediterranean island of Elba, along with an annual pension. His wife, Marie-Louise, and son, the King of Rome, were sent back to Austria. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, with Louis XVIII, Louis XVI brother, placed on the throne by the Allies. France's borders were largely returned to their 1792 lines. The European powers convened the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe and attempt to restore the old order. Napoleon's exile on Elba did not last long. He closely monitored the situation in France. The restored Bourbon regime under Louis XVIII failed to win popular support. The arrogance of the returning émigré nobles, the reversal of some revolutionary gains, the downsizing of the army, and the mistreatment of Napoleonic veterans all fueled widespread discontent. Napoleon also learned of disagreements among the Allies at the Congress of Vienna and rumors that they planned to exile him to a more remote location. He decided the time was right for a comeback. On February 26, 1815, taking advantage of lax surveillance, Napoleon escaped Elba with about 1,000 loyal followers aboard a small flotilla. On March 1st, he landed at Golfe-Juan on the southern coast of France. He issued proclamations calling on the French people to rally to his cause and overthrow the Bourbons. His journey north turned into a triumphal procession. Instead of resistance, he was greeted with enthusiastic cheers from soldiers and civilians alike. Troops sent to intercept him defected en masse to his side. The most iconic moment occurred near Grenoble. Facing royal troops ordered to stop him, Napoleon advanced alone, opened his coat, and declared, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers, overcome, broke ranks, shouting "Vive l'Empereur." They tore off their white Bourbon cockades and replaced them with the revolutionary tricolor. Napoleon's return swept through France like a storm. On March 20th, he entered Paris without firing a shot and reoccupied the Tuileries Palace. Louis XVIII fled hastily to Ghent in Belgium. Napoleon was once again the ruler of France. This period, from his landing in France to his final defeat, is known as the 100 Days. Napoleon's restoration stunned the European powers gathered in Vienna. They quickly set aside their differences, declared Napoleon an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world, outlawed him, and formed the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing vast armies to depose him once again. Facing overwhelming odds, Napoleon knew time was short. He tried to garner domestic support by enacting constitutional reforms, the Charter of 1815, or Additional Act, projecting a more liberal image. Simultaneously, he worked frantically to rebuild his army, planning to strike proactively. His strategy was to defeat the Allied forces stationed in Belgium, the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Marshal Blücher, before the main Austrian and Russian armies could arrive. In mid-June 1815, Napoleon led an army of about 120,000 men into Belgium. His plan was to drive a wedge between Wellington's and Blücher's armies, separate them, and defeat them individually. On June 16th, Napoleon defeated Blücher's Prussians at the Battle of Ligny, but failed to destroy them completely, allowing the Prussians to retreat in relatively good order. On the same day, at the Battle of Quatre-Bras, Marshal Ney's French left wing fought Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces to a standstill, failing to achieve a decisive victory or prevent Wellington from maintaining contact with the Prussians. June 18th became the decisive day. Near the small town of Waterloo, south of Brussels, Napoleon confronted Wellington's multinational army, composed of British, German, Dutch, and Belgian troops. Wellington chose a strong defensive position along a ridge, anchored by key fortified farmhouses, Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint. Heavy rain the previous night had turned the ground muddy, forcing Napoleon to delay his attack. This delay proved crucial, giving Blücher's Prussian reinforcements precious time to march towards the battlefield. The French attack began in the afternoon. The fighting was ferocious, with desperate struggles for control of the key strong points. French infantry assaults and repeated massed cavalry charges led by Marshal Ney failed to break Wellington's resilient line. La Haye-Saint eventually fell to the French, but the main Allied line held firm. By early evening, Blücher's Prussian forces finally arrived on the battlefield, attacking the French right flank with ferocity. Napoleon was now caught between two converging forces. In a last desperate gamble, he committed his final reserve, the elite, undefeated Imperial Guard, hoping to break Wellington's center. However, facing withering British firepower, even the legendary Guard faltered and was repulsed. The cry "La Garde recule," the Guard retreats, spread panic through the French ranks, leading to a general collapse. The Battle of Waterloo ended in a total French defeat. Napoleon's army suffered devastating losses, and he himself fled back to Paris in disarray. The battle not only ended the 100 Days but also conclusively terminated Napoleon's political and military career. Returning to Paris, Napoleon found himself abandoned by political allies, and the legislature demanded his second abdication. On June 22nd, he abdicated again, this time in favor of his son, the King of Rome, styled Napoleon II, though he never actually ruled. He hoped to escape to the United States, but found French ports blockaded by the Royal Navy. Ultimately, he decided to surrender to the British, hoping for political asylum. He boarded the British warship HMS Bellerophon and wrote a letter to the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, comparing himself to Themistocles seeking refuge. However, the British government and the Allied powers were determined to eliminate Napoleon as a threat permanently. They refused him asylum and decided to exile him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. It was an extremely isolated, easily defensible volcanic island, nearly 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles, from the African coast and over 3,000 kilometers, 1,900 miles, from South America. In October 1815, Napoleon arrived on St. Helena to begin the final years of his life in exile. He resided at Longwood House, under the strict surveillance and harsh treatment of the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe. The former master of Europe was now a prisoner, cut off from the world. Only a few loyal followers accompanied him, including the Comte de Las Cases, General Bertrand, and General Montholon. During his 6 years on St. Helena, Napoleon's life was monotonous and oppressive. He spent most of his time dictating his memoirs, recorded by Las Cases and others, becoming the famous Memorial de Saint Helene, reading, taking walks, and playing chess or conversing with his companions. In his memoirs, he vigorously defended his actions, portraying himself as the heir to the French Revolution's ideals, a promoter of European peace and unity, and a tragic hero persecuted by the old regimes and British conspiracies. These memoirs, published after his death, greatly influenced posthumous perceptions of him and fostered the Napoleonic legend. Over time, Napoleon's health steadily declined. He suffered from stomach ailments, possibly stomach cancer or ulcers, and liver problems. The damp climate of the island and his depressed state of mind accelerated his decline. On May 5, 1821, after a long period of suffering, Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena at the age of 51. The cause of his death remains debated. Besides the official cause of stomach cancer, some theories suggest arsenic poisoning based on high levels found in hair samples, possibly from medication or environmental exposure. His last words were reportedly, "France Army, tête d'armée, Josephine. France Army, head of the army, Josephine." Napoleon was initially buried in the Seine Valley on St. Helena. It was not until 1840 that, following negotiations initiated by King Louis Philippe of France's July monarchy, the British government agreed to return Napoleon's remains to France. His coffin was transported back to Paris amidst grand ceremonies and fervent public welcome, finally laid to rest under the dome of Les Invalides. It remains a major historical monument in France, drawing countless visitors to this day. The eagle from Corsica, after a glorious flight and a tragic fall, finally returned in spirit to the France he once ruled and deeply loved. Chapter 6. Enduring Legacy, Controversial Giant, Echoes in History. Napoleon Bonaparte, the figure who stirred the entire European continent and beyond in the early 19th century, did not see his influence dissipate with his death. On the contrary, his passing initiated enduring debates about his merits and flaws, his historical significance, and his legacy, which has continued to shape France, Europe, and the world in profound and lasting ways. First, we must examine his transformation of and impact on France. Napoleon ended the chaos of the later stages of the French Revolution, restoring order and stability. He established an efficient, centralized administrative system. Institutions like the prefects and the Council of State, Conseil d'État, still function in France today. He founded the Bank of France, stabilizing national finances and laying groundwork for economic development. His national education system, particularly the lycées, has cultivated generations of French talent. The Legion of Honor he established, recognizing individual merit regardless of birth, remains France's highest distinction. Undoubtedly, his most significant legacy is the Napoleonic Code, the Civil Code. With its clear articles and rigorous logic, this code enshrined core principles of the bourgeois revolution: equality before the law, protection of private property, and freedom of contract. It not only became the bedrock of the modern French legal system, but was also widely disseminated across Europe, Latin America, and other parts of the world, serving as a model for civil codes in many nations. In essence, the Napoleonic Code codified the positive outcomes of the French Revolution and propagated them globally, its influence far exceeding that of all his military victories. However, Napoleon's impact on France was not entirely positive. His empire ultimately collapsed, and the incessant wars drained France's manpower, resources, and wealth, costing the nation an entire generation of young men. While he consolidated some revolutionary achievements, he also suppressed democracy and liberty, establishing a personal dictatorship and restoring hereditary rule and titles of nobility, albeit a new nobility. His strict control over the press and speech, along with the pervasive surveillance conducted by Fouché's police system, bore clear hallmarks of autocracy. Second, Napoleon profoundly influenced the political landscape of Europe and the world. His conquests irrevocably shattered Europe's old feudal order. Wherever his armies went, though accompanied by conquest and plunder, they also spread the ideas of the French Revolution, challenging feudal systems and abolishing serfdom and privileges, especially in German and Italian territories. The implementation of the Napoleonic Code also objectively fostered social progress and legal development in these regions. The Napoleonic Wars significantly spurred the rise of European nationalism. On one hand, French expansion fueled France's own national pride and patriotism. On the other, French aggression and domination ignited resistance and a sense of national identity among conquered or threatened peoples such as the Spanish, Germans, and Russians. The formation of modern European nation-states was, to a large extent, catalyzed by the Napoleonic era. His warfare itself transformed the nature of war. Napoleon's military thought and practices, emphasizing concentration of force, rapid maneuver, massed artillery fire, the creation of the corps d'armée system, and embryonic forms of total war, had a revolutionary impact on subsequent military theory and practice. Military classics like Karl von Clausewitz's On War were written in deep reflection upon the Napoleonic Wars. Countless military leaders throughout history have studied and sought to emulate Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna attempted to erase the Napoleonic era's influence and restore Europe's old order, but the wheels of history could not be turned back. The seeds of change sown by Napoleon eventually sprouted in the turbulent events of the 19th century, such as the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, and the unification movements in Italy and Germany. The centralized state model he established was also emulated by many emerging nations. Third, Napoleon himself, as a historical figure, remains deeply complex and controversial. He was simultaneously a brilliant military genius, a reform-minded statesman, and an efficient administrator, yet also an ambitious dictator, a ruthless conqueror, and a war machine seemingly indifferent to human life. Supporters and admirers, adherents of the Napoleonic legend, tend to emphasize his achievements, stabilizing France, codifying the law, spreading revolutionary ideals, accomplishing great deeds, and bringing glory to France. They view him as one of the greatest figures in French history, a hero of humble origins who changed the world through his talent and effort. The works of literary giants like Victor Hugo and Stendhal contain complex portrayals and, to some extent, admiration for Napoleon. Critics focus more on his negative impacts, the immense suffering and loss of life caused by his relentless wars across Europe, his insatiable thirst for power leading to imperial overreach and ultimate collapse, his autocratic rule suppressing freedom, and the aggressive and oppressive nature of his conquest and domination of other nations. They regard him as a tyrant who sacrificed countless lives for personal ambition and glory. This controversy stems partly from Napoleon's own deliberate shaping of his image. From the Italian campaign onwards, he skillfully used propaganda, military bulletins, proclamations, to embellish his victories and persona. His dictated memoirs on St. Helena were a crucial effort to justify his actions and construct the Napoleonic legend. He portrayed himself as the son of the revolution, a peacemaker, forced into war, and a precursor of European unity, attempting to shift blame for the wars onto his opponents, particularly intransigent Britain and the representatives of the old order. To this day, evaluating Napoleon remains a matter of perspective. Historians strive for greater objectivity in analyzing his motivations, actions, and their complex consequences. He is undeniably one of the most influential individuals in world history, a quintessential example of the times create the hero, and the hero also creates the times. His rise was inseparable from the historical opportunities presented by the French Revolution, yet his personal talent, ambition, and actions profoundly altered the course of history. His life resembles a dazzling comet streaking across the early 19th century sky, leaving behind a brief, incandescent brilliance and long, far-reaching echoes. He was both an ender of the old era and a herald of the new. He embodied the contradictions between reason and passion, creation and destruction, liberation and subjugation. To understand Napoleon is to understand that turbulent, transitional era of immense change. His story continues to ignite imagination and provoke endless reflection and debate. From the boy from Corsica to the Emperor of the French, from the son of Austerlitz to the sunset at Waterloo, and finally, to the solitude of St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte's life itself is an immortal epic encapsulating the ambition, glory, tragedy, and complexity of human history. Conclusion. Thank you for listening. The life of Napoleon Bonaparte was tumultuous, legendary, and filled with profound historical lessons. His story is far from over. Discussion and research about him continue unabated. If you enjoyed this journey through history and wish to learn more about the pivotal figures and major events that have shaped our world, please remember to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating content. We look forward to meeting you again on our next historical exploration.